Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my September wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read during the month of September. So September was a kind of medium reading month for me. I read 9 books, but 2 of them I had started in August, so I feel like I haven't actually got that many books read this month. However, I did read some brilliant books, and the main reason why I didn't get so much read this month is because of the first book I'm going to talk to you about, which is Middlemarch by George Eliot. This took up quite a lot of my month. So I first read Middlemarch about 8 or 9 years ago when I was 15 or 16, and I didn't like it that much. I have a feeling on reflection that I possibly exaggerated in my mind how much I didn't like George Eliot's Middlemarch, and that actually I liked it more at 15 than I thought. But definitely when I was 15 years old I did find it a bit boring, and I thought it was about time that I reread it. I reread it partly for my Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course video on this and Cranford, which is late but will be up fairly soon, and I will link that down below when it is up. And then I also read this because I thought it was about time that I gave it another chance, especially because a few booktubers, notably Leanne Rose and Jen from Insert Literary Pun Here, have read or reread Middlemarch in the last few months and really enjoyed it, and the videos they made on it really persuaded me that it was about time I gave this book another chance. And I have to say I did enjoy George Eliot's Middlemarch a lot more on a second reading. There are a lot of things that I really liked about it, and I did find it quite interesting. So Middlemarch is a Victorian novel, though it's set a little bit before the Victorian period. It's set in the early 1830s, around the time of the Great Reform Act, which is where the voting franchise in Britain was extended quite a lot. It's set in the town of Middlemarch and the surrounding villages, and basically examines what Eliot calls provincial life, following a few different characters, notably Dorothea Brooke, who is the niece of a local landowner, Dr. Lydgate, the new doctor in town, Fred and Rosamond Vincey, a brother and sister who are the children of the mayor, and Mary Garth, a young woman who is the daughter of a land agent and is one of my favourite characters. There are a lot of things that I do really like about Middlemarch. I find it a very interesting book in terms of the way it looks at life in a small town at the time and the relations between the characters. I do find some of the plot lines really interesting, and the way it examines marriage and the difficulties of marriage I think are really good. I love Fred and Mary and their story, and they are definitely my favourite characters. But I did also appreciate Dr. Lydgate's storyline and Dorothea's storyline, I think a lot more this time than when I was 15. When I first read Middlemarch, I found Dorothea as a character very boring and not very engaging, but on this rereading I really enjoyed Dorothea's character and her plotline a lot more. It's still not my favourite Victorian book. I don't think that George Eliot will ever be up in my favourite Victorian authors because I just don't love her writing style. I find her writing a bit dry and a bit too highbrow for me. I think in terms of the Victorians, I would rather read someone who is a little bit comical and a little bit silly like Dickens, or someone who is more focused on character and small details like Gaskell, than someone who is focused more on description and analysis like George Eliot. Regardless, I did really appreciate Middlemarch a lot more on this rereading, and I'm really glad I gave it another chance. I'm certainly enjoying George Eliot a little bit more, and it's making me even more excited to pick up The Mill on the Floss this month during the month of October. Continuing on with the classics, I also read 3 books by Margaret Oliphant this month and had a little bit of a Margaret Oliphant binge. Margaret Oliphant is a Victorian author whose work I really enjoy. She is very underrated and a lot of her books are out of print, but I've been really interested in her Carlingford Chronicles because they are a series of books all set in the same town, and I know from Anthony Trollope's The Barsetshire Chronicles that I really enjoy that setup. So I read 3 of Oliphant's Carlingford Chronicles during the month of September, and they were The Rector, The Doctor's Family and Salem Chapel. The Rector deals with a middle-aged clergyman who moves into the town, and having lived for a long time as an academic in a college, he knows the Bible back to front. Academically, he would be a brilliant clergyman. He's really qualified, but when he comes to this town as a parish clergyman, he begins to realise that there is a lot more to being a clergyman than just the theory. There's a lot more to being a clergyman than knowing your theology, and there's a lot to do with the different relationships you have with other people and the role that you play within the parish. He begins to realise that perhaps he's not quite so good a clergyman as he thought. I really loved The Rector. I think it's probably my favourite of the 3. It's a novella, it's very short, but it's really engaging, and I found the Rector a really interesting character, so I would highly recommend that one. The Doctor's Family follows a young man called Dr. Ryder, who is a doctor in Carlingford. His brother Fred has recently come back from Australia, and his brother is rather dissipated, his brother is rather lazy, his brother doesn't want to do anything for their upkeep. And then one day, 2 women and several children turn up at Ryder's door, and one of the women says that she is Fred's wife, which Ryder didn't know that he had, and everything kind of goes on from there. It's a really interesting book and one that I certainly enjoyed. It's very funny in places places, and one of the things I quite liked about it is that Dr. Ryder isn't always a likeable character. He can be quite frustrating at times, but you also do sort of feel for him. I also really liked the character of Nettie, Fred's sister-in-law. I thought she was really, really interesting, and I liked her plotline on how it examined issues of duty and independence, and I also really liked the fact that she is like the only character in the book that has it together. I feel like quite a lot of Oliphant's books feature a male protagonist who kind of doesn't know what he's doing, who is countered with a woman who knows completely everything that's going on and has a lot more sense than her male protagonist, and therefore I feel like she kind of has a little bit of a joke at the male protagonist's expense, which is something that can be quite entertaining and turn the tables on other conventional Victorian novels. So I certainly enjoyed The Doctor's Family. And then the third Carlingford Chronicle book I read was Salem Chapel by Margaret Oliphant. This was probably my least favourite. I'm not entirely certain why. It was quite a bit longer than the other two, and I found the pacing a little bit less good. It follows a young man called Arthur Vincent. He is a nonconformist clergyman, and he moves to Carlingford in order to become the clergyman of Salem Chapel. He's a bit disappointed to discover that the people who attend Salem Chapel are of all rather a lower class than him, and not necessarily the people with whom he'd want to be friends with. But he then soon meets Lady Weston, a beautiful young widow with whom he falls in love, and also a slightly older woman called Mrs. Hillard, a mysterious woman who seems to have a much better education than her station in life would suggest. And while he is settling into Carlingford, he begins to hear news of changes in the life at home of his mother and sister. Salem Chapel is much more of a sensationalist novel than the other Margaret Oliphant books I've read. It's much more page-turnery, much more plot-driven, and a bit less quiet, which actually I don't think I liked quite as much, because I don't think it left as much time to examine the sort of issues and characters there. And I couldn't really work out how I was supposed to feel about Arthur Vincent, because I didn't always like him, but unlike in The Doctor's Family, where I kind of got what Margaret Oliphant was doing with that and kind of came round to like Dr. Ryder more eventually, with Salem Chapel I'm not really sure how I feel about Arthur Vincent. I still really enjoyed it. It's definitely worth a read, even though it wasn't my favourite one, and I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the Carlingford Chronicles, especially Miss Marjoribanks, which I'll be reading this month during Victober, and which Kate Howe and I are hosting a read-along for, and I will link that Goodreads group down below. And then the other Victorian book I read this month was Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. This was a reread for me, and I listened to it on audiobook, and I adored it so much, like so much. It was amazing. It was incredible. I'd forgotten how good it was. I first read it about the same time I read Middlemarch, probably about 9 years ago, and I really enjoyed it at the time, but I'd just forgotten how absolutely brilliant it is. It has shot up like my list of my favourite books of all time, and it's absolutely wonderful. I would highly, highly recommend it. It follows a young woman called Molly Gibson who lives with her father. Her mother died a long time ago, and what happens when her father decides to remarry, and how Molly's relationship with her stepmother and stepsister plays out. It's a really, really interesting and enjoyable book. It's a brilliant look at small towns and examines really interestingly issues of class and grief and growing up, and it's so beautiful and really well worth a read. It's absolutely brilliantly written, and the characterisation is superb. I have done an individual book review of this as part of my 2 weeks of Elizabeth Gaskell, and I'll link that video down below because that is much more in-depth than here, but it is absolutely brilliant, and it was my favourite book this month and probably my second favourite read of the year after my reread of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South earlier on in the year. This year has definitely been a good year for Elizabeth Gaskell. And then an Edwardian one, I read The Return of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is another Sherlock Holmes short story collection. This me and my boyfriend Nick listened to together on audiobook, and I think we've been listening to it since August and possibly since July, so quite a long time. But we finished it this month and I really, really enjoyed it. I really enjoy Sherlock Holmes in general, and I much prefer the short stories to the novels for the most part, so it's really enjoyable to listen to another series of short stories, and there were some great ones here. I especially like The Mystery of Sir Charles Augustus Milverton, which another two favourites were The Adventure of the Abbey Grange and The Adventure of the Second Stain. One of the things I really enjoy in the Sherlock Holmes stories is where Sherlock Holmes kind of uses his own standard of morality to judge things and to decide how much he reveals to the police, and kind of makes his own system of judgment rather than the law, which is something I find really, really interesting and explores quite interesting themes. As always, I really enjoyed that Sherlock Holmes collection, and one I would highly recommend. Moving away from the classics, I only read one contemporary novel this month. I don't know what happened. That's very, very rare for me. I think part of me just kind of wanted to start Victober early, and so I read a lot of Victorian literature. But the one contemporary novel I read this month was absolutely incredible, and I am so excited to talk more about it, and that was Manhattan Beach by Jennifer Egan. I think I'm going to make a full review of this because I have so much to say and I loved it so much. But suffice to say, I really, really love this book. I really like Jennifer Egan. I've read two of her books before, Emerald City and A Visit from the Goon Squad. Emerald City is a short story collection, and A Visit from the Goon Squad is somewhere between a short story collection and a novel. This is her first historical fiction novel, and it's just been published in the UK. Publishers Corsair, who are part of Little Brown, very kindly sent me a review copy, and I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed this. It's set in the 1930s and 40s in New York. It follows a young woman called Anna and her family, and also examines the role that she has to play in the war work that she does. There are so many things about Manhattan Beach that I absolutely loved. For one thing, I just don't think there is another author who could have written about gangsters in a way that is so entirely uncliche and uncheesy and brilliant. She writes absolutely beautifully, both like lyrically and easily. I read Manhattan Beach in just a few days. I flew through it and it was absolutely wonderful. I found the historical detail and the general historical world building really, really brilliant. I don't actually know that much about American involvement in World War II, so that in itself was really, really interesting. But one of the things this book deals with is volunteer divers who would volunteer to learn how to do deep sea diving so that they could repair ships. Not something I knew anything about. I would have known nothing about how diving worked in the 1940s, but you can tell how thoroughly researched Jennifer Egan is and just how fascinating a topic this is. I think there are so many other really interesting aspects in this book. It was very well written, very dramatic, had a wonderful plot, but also took its time to do really effectively and importantly with interesting themes of family, of grief, of disability, of sexuality, of reputation, gender and race discrimination, and so many fascinating things. Like I said, I'm going to do a full review of this because I loved it so much, but this is definitely brilliant. One of my favourite books of the year so far, and I would highly, highly recommend it. And then finally, I read 2 non-fiction books this month. One was The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry. This I have been reading for a little while, but finally finished this month. This is a non-fiction book by the sculptor Grayson Perry, talking about modern masculinity and what it means to be a man now. For the most part, I found this really, really interesting. It was an engaging read and dealt effectively, I think, with a lot of issues to do with masculinity and how masculinity and what it means to be a man has changed with feminist movements and what that might mean and how masculinity might evolve in the future. The only 2 criticisms I would have of it, which I'm not sure if they are actually my criticisms or Nick's, because he also read it a few months ago and we were discussing it. I'm not sure if I would have thought of these things if he hadn't mentioned them, but I don't think there's much that's new in there, and I felt like a lot of it I have read in other places. But the main thing I think is that because Grayson Perry is an older man, this book is not really about 21st century masculinity, it's more about late 20th century masculinity. The issues and the different varieties of masculinities and the expectations and gender roles for young men today are probably a little bit different. I feel like I would like to read more about contemporary masculinity. I've read quite a lot on the history of masculinity, which was a topic I looked at university, but I would like to read some more contemporary non-fiction on gender. And finally, the other non-fiction book I read this month was this, which is Same-Sex Love 1700 to 1957 by Jill Rossini. This is their review copy, which was very kindly sent to me by the publisher Pen and Sword. I saw Lil from Lil's Vintage World, whose channel I'll link down below, talking about this on her channel and saying that the publishers sent it to her, and I thought that sounds really, really fascinating. I wonder if they will send me a copy too, which they very kindly did, so I'm very, very grateful because this was fascinating and really, really good. It is, as the title suggests, a history of same-sex love from 1700 to 1957 and looks at how same-sex relationships changed over that time, how widely they were known about and how widely they were persecuted. At times it is quite a depressing read, but it's also quite an uplifting read and certainly an interesting one. There are 2 main reasons why I wanted to read this. One, just because I thought it would be really interesting, and 2, because I write quite a lot of historical fiction and I often have LGBT characters in my historical fiction and I don't want to be inaccurate or anachronistic. So in that sense, not only was it a really interesting read, but it was also a really, really useful one for me, and you can see I've tabbed quite a lot of stuff that I think will be useful in my writing as well as really, really interesting. Not only does this book provide a lot of really interesting historical context and facts, the one thing I really appreciated about it is that it's very tactful and sensible and ethical in its history, because it is quite hard to write a history of homosexuality in Britain. The fact is that there is limited evidence. Most of the evidence we have of same-sex relationships between men comes from where men were arrested and tried. When it comes to same-sex relationships between women, especially in the 18th and 19th century, there's very limited evidence and it's really hard to know how to interpret the evidence we have, especially because custom and language changes so much over time. And okay, so if you read a really passionate letter from one woman to another in the 19th century that has what read to a modern audience like declarations of love, are they declarations of a romantic love, or is that just the way that people spoke about friendship? One of the things I thought was really good about this history is that Rossini says again and again and makes it very clear that actually for the most part we just don't know. It's not fair and it's not ethical to interpret as fact what we don't know to be fact. This book is very well researched and really, really well presented and tactfully done, and I thought it was really great. The only thing I will say is that it's really quite short, and although that meant I probably got through it faster and that I got to it quicker, I could have read like a book 5 times this long and been really, really fascinated. And I don't know if that's just to do with the amount of source material available, and she does rely mostly on primary sources in here, which is something I really appreciate. But regardless, like I said, this is a really, really fascinating book and one I would highly recommend. And although I kind of wish it was longer, also look at the length of it. It's not going to take you very long and it's well worth a read. I'm so glad I read this. Really, really informative, really interesting, and really, really useful for my historical fiction writing. So those are the 9 books that I read during the month of September. Please let me know down in the comments what your favourite book of the month was. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.